people. What we're talking about today, I'm Nairn Mackay, I'm with Anti-Poverty Regina, and what we're talking about today is a campaign for an act to eliminate poverty in Saskatchewan. Poverty is in part legislated, and we want to work to end legislated poverty. And I'm with Peter Gilmer here with Regina Anti-Poverty Ministry, who has been working on a campaign for an anti-poverty act in Saskatchewan for...
Well, we actually started looking at this concept back in 2002. And the reason that the Anti-Poverty Ministry started to focus on the need for an act to eliminate poverty in Saskatchewan was a combination of two things that came together. One was that we had gone through a consultation process, a combination of conferences and other consultations with persons living in poverty and groups working on poverty issues. And in that process, as well as in our day-to-day casework for low-income people, what we found was that the same issues kept arising over and over again. And broadly speaking, they tended to fit into a few different categories. The first was the need for adequate income security benefits. Second, a living wage, quality and affordable housing and childcare, equity initiatives for groups that disproportionately bear the brunt of poverty, and finally the need for a system of fair taxation or better distribution of wealth. What we found in that process was that many of the things that we were looking at also fell into a basic human rights framework. And indeed, we knew that the UN Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which Canada signed off on and ratified in 1976 with the approval and the commitment of all the provinces, holds many of these rights, or looks at many of these issues as actual basic human rights. So an adequate income, like an adequate income assistance benefits, a living wage, quality housing and childcare. These are not just public policy issues or social policy issues, as they're often considered to be in government circles, but they're actually basic human rights that we've committed ourselves to under international law. And really what is needed is to entrench those rights in a way that they provide real protections around these issues for people. So we want to make sure that society as a whole looks at these as basic human rights, but also that we have the framework in place to ensure that we don't come to a place as we have over the years whereby our income assistance benefits are so woefully inadequate that we have a minimum wage that falls so far below being an actual living wage, where we have a shortage of affordable housing with all the problems that causes, and where we have the fewest licensed childcare spaces in the country. So starting to look at these through the lens of a human rights framework is really, I believe, central to making sure that we start to shift public policy in a way that it actually meets the needs and protects the rights of people.
Okay, and certainly there is a question of accountability. Why in particular now are we moving forward on that?
Well, in the course of the last few years, there's been a lot of discussion around anti-poverty strategies. And so now a vast majority of the provinces, including Saskatchewan, have anti-poverty strategies in place. But the one thing that most provinces, including Saskatchewan, are missing is a legislative piece, a piece that actually puts targets and intent into actual legislation and timelines, etc. But there's no province yet, and the federal government as well, who now has come down with its own strategy, there's no place that actually has proactive social and economic rights legislated. And that's really the missing piece if we're going to make sure that we provide a real protections for people, that we actually move towards ending. If we're serious about ending legislated poverty, then we really need to have the rights that we've committed to under international law protected within domestic or provincial legislation.
Now, legislated poverty is a critical piece for people to understand.
Right. So when, for instance, when we allow governments to set social assistance rates at inadequate levels, when we allow the minimum wage to be set at below a living wage level, when we don't ensure that we have affordable housing for everybody, when we don't ensure quality and affordable childcare for those who need it, we are in effect legislating poverty, and that's what governments have done for years. So, and basically that's been the history of social policy, though I would argue it's gotten considerably worse over the years. So, and some of the examples that I would give of setting legislated poverty is the fact that, first of all, we went 25 years in this province without any significant boost to income assistance rates from 1981 until 2006. Got a little bit of a bump between the 2005 and 2007 budgets. But now we have a social assistance basic allowance, basic adult allowances, which is for food, clothing, personal and household items, and transportation, a monthly allowance of only $255 that's been at that same rate for 12 consecutive years. The transitional employment allowance, which is a program for those persons who are deemed potentially employable, is set in Regina and Saskatchewan and some of the larger centres at $563 per month to meet shelter as well as those other needs. The only thing that it doesn't cover is utilities, which they do provide a capped rate for. But that rate is not, so we're $20 less than we were in 2007. 10 years ago in 2009. So that shows really legislating poverty for people, and a minimum wage that still falls so far below a living wage.
So why not just direct campaigns for raising the minimum wage and raising social assistance rates?
Yeah. Well, I guess for us, what we've done, because we've been involved in pushing on all of these issues, we've long called for raising the rates for social assistance. We've long called for raising the minimum wage to a living wage. We've long called for quality and affordable housing and childcare. But the reality is that this packages them into looking at it comprehensively, these issues comprehensively, but it also puts it within a rights framework rather than strictly a social policy framework. We're not just looking at tinkering to make improvements. We're saying these are basic human rights that everybody has that we need to make sure that everybody can count on.
So I go to work, I earn the national average of about, I think it's $38,000 a year. Why should my taxes go to allow someone to live for nothing?
Well, I guess first of all, what we know is that the majority of people on income assistance programs either have disabilities or significant barriers to workforce participation. The reality is that many people who've been on the transitional employment allowance recycle in and out of employment. We also know that the biggest tax rate for any group of people is the wage clawback or earned income clawback for people who are on income assistance programs, whereby, for instance, an employable person is only allowed to keep the first $50 of earned income before it's clawed back from benefits, and then 25% of the rest to a maximum of $200. A person with a disability is only allowed to keep $200 in earned income and 25% of the rest to a maximum of $325 per month. So when we look at that level of clawback, these are persons who are actually, we could say, being taxed back at an extremely high rate. But beyond that, I mean, I think we also have to look at the benefits for society as a whole. That the reality is that allowing the level of poverty that we have, allowing the level of inequality that we have in our society, has all kinds of ripple effects that cause problems for all of us. And all the research suggests that the narrower the gap in terms of economic inequality, the higher the quality of life in your society is, the better the health and happiness of people is. So I would argue that we all benefit by making sure that we raise the bottom up and make sure that we have a base level that people can actually survive on.
So can't we just give more to charity?
Well, the charity is presently, in some cases, necessary, but it certainly isn't a solution. Ultimately, we need social and economic justice. We need to be looking at these issues not just in terms of giving from those who can afford to give, but also with, often with strings attached and in ways where where it's directed in ways that people want it to go. The bottom line is that people have a right to an adequate standard of living, and that involves a rights protection, which I would say, along with greater equity and equality, is what we would describe as social and economic justice.
So a legislated act to eliminate poverty in Saskatchewan is one piece of that solution.
Yeah.
That acknowledging that the government does has a significant role to play.
Right. Well, I would say, I mean, first of all, it is a commitment that the province has already made, but unfortunately, governments have not been held to account in terms of commitments that they've made. And I would suggest that it bodes very poorly in terms of the future for other commitments that we've made as a country, such as the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, that if we have now gone almost 43 years without entrenching rights that we committed to under the UN Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights in 1976, if we still don't have any legislated or domestic remedy and protections, then it doesn't bode well for what we say. And now, really, at the end of the day, we're saying let's be true to what we've committed to on paper, what we have said that we believe in as a country and as a province.
So if people want to support a campaign for an act to eliminate poverty in Saskatchewan, what would you recommend they do?
Well, I do think that there's a range of things. One is that certainly our decision makers need to be hearing directly from them. That means that we need to be all calling on, as a community, as a cross-section of society, we need to be calling on the Premier, on the Cabinet, on the opposition, on all levels of government to be looking at entrenching an act. And we need to be promoting this with our friends, our neighbors, with as wide a cross-section of society as we can. So I think that, certainly we know that social media will play a role in that, otherwise we wouldn't be here today. But certainly we need to develop a strong grassroots campaign to push on this. And we know that there is support from a good cross-section. We've certainly heard and spoken to leaders who have committed to this already, but we need to build that base to make sure that we really are committed to ending poverty in Saskatchewan, that we're taking seriously all the consequences of legislated poverty in Saskatchewan, and that we're making sure that people's basic social and economic rights are met.
Okay, and that's a good point at which to wrap up. Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, thank you, Mary. Appreciate it.